Episode 2 Theories of Surveillance. Why reduce our digital footprint? In this second episode, we will look at the many reasons we may wish to reduce our digital footprints, tying this into theory from the literature on surveillance in a modern world of big data. We will consider the arguments for and against reducing this footprint, touching on such issues as law enforcement, anti-terrorism, privacy, and even world health issues. Part 1. A word on metadata. With all the recent debate in Australia about metadata, it is important to understand what it's all about and how it will affect you. In October 2014, the federal government introduced the Telecommunications, Interception and Access Amendment Data Retention Bill and tabled this in Parliament. In April of this year, 2015, this bill was passed and became law in Australia. Now, the reason this bill has caused so much drama is that Australian phone and internet providers will now be required by law to store 2 years' worth of their customers' metadata. It's worth repeating what was said in episode 1 of this series, that the term metadata encapsulates the identity of a subscriber and the source, destination, date, time, duration, and type of communication. It does not include the content of a message, phone call, or email, and does not include web browsing history. The public response to this has been mixed. There is a camp of people who find this an outrageous intrusion into privacy and violation of our civil liberties, yet there is another camp who feel that they are doing nothing wrong anyway, so who cares? I admit at first I was part of this second group, but as I explored this in more depth, I realized that the issues were far deeper and wide-reaching than I had thought initially. There are several important questions that I believe are yet to be answered, including where will this data be stored, who will be responsible for the storage, protection, and oversight of this data, who will be footing the bill, and what kind of security will be used to protect this data. If you want to understand the nitty-gritty of how this will all work in practice, an excellent article available online has been written by Peter Leonard entitled Internet Data Retention in Australia, New Controversies and Complexities. I've provided a link to this article in the description section of this video. One of the things that struck me when reading this article as particularly alarming was just how much power the Act prescribes the Minister for Communications. This appears to give quite a lot of power to one person, the Minister, who is then authorised to declare any particular body an enforcement agency, which can then request information or metadata from service providers. Furthermore, the Minister can adjust and expand the rules by establishing any regulation he or she sees fit to complement the Act. On top of all this, questions have been raised over how law enforcement agencies can run big data analytics on a collection of metadata taken from ISPs whilst behaving in an ethical and appropriate manner. In a publication by Alana, Maurushat and her colleagues presented to the 15th International Conference on Artificial Intelligence and Law at the University of San Diego, it was pointed out that de-identifying or anonymizing large pools of metadata to track crime patterns or trends can be problematic. This publication, entitled Using Big Metadata for Criminal Intelligence, Understanding Limitations and Appropriate Safeguards, raises several important issues. One major issue is that when law enforcement agencies utilize metadata in this way, there will be a risk of individuals who are not suspects of any criminal activities inevitably coming to the attention of law enforcement agencies. It was also suggested that when algorithms are applied to large amounts of metadata to predict criminal activities, there is a danger that machine learning algorithms may in fact learn to discriminate based on certain categories such as race. The vast majority of the academic research and literature on the area of metadata seems to point out that whilst big data can be a useful tool for law enforcement and intelligence agencies, there are so many ethical dilemmas that must be considered. In my opinion, these dilemmas should be discussed openly and transparently with all stakeholders involved, represented and considered. Until this discussion is had, the important lessons of this video series in reducing your digital footprint will only continue to become more necessary. Part 2. Other purposes of mass surveillance and big data. With the emergence almost daily of new threats to national security, many argue that mass surveillance is now more than ever something that should be embraced. Around the time Edward Snowden was famously leaking the NSA programs in Hong Kong, the Australian Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security was considering increasing Australia's intelligence and surveillance laws. Many parties, including the Law Council of Australia, the Human Rights Centre, and the Institute of Public Affairs, raised objections. Their arguments against strengthening surveillance capabilities was more or less that the imposition of such extraordinary, systematic, and universal programs would render any Australian right to privacy empty. I encourage you to read an article published in 2014 by Senator John Faulkner entitled Surveillance, Intelligence and Accountability, an Australian Story. This is available online, and I've posted a link in the description of this video. It outlines a history of national security surveillance in Australia with 8 suggestions about improvement of oversight. Senator Faulkner is the former Labor Minister for Defence, a member of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, and a member of the National Security Committee of Federal Cabinet. What is clear is that there is a distinct tension between the need to protect Australia from an increasing threat of terrorism whilst balancing privacy needs of Australian citizens. The government needs to be transparent to an extent, however this will always be difficult since the very nature of counter-terrorism requires secrecy in the methods used for detecting terrorists at work. As we already talked about in episode 1, the aggregation of data for commercial purposes is now so widespread that companies developing big data technologies seem to be churning out billionaires on an almost weekly basis. In his article, The Collision Between Big Data and Privacy Law, Stephen Wilson points out that many companies, including the many networking sites we use daily, are utilizing sophisticated data processing algorithms and applying these to the data they collect. This allows marketers and various other analysts to get hold of extremely rich personal information that we have no idea what they are doing with. Often, this data is sold onwards without us having any idea where it will end up and who will be responsible for its security and storage. I've included a link to this article in the description section if you're interested in exploring this topic further. In saying all this, however, there are areas where the benefits of using big data tools clearly outweigh the potential for abuse. For instance, looking at the example of public health, Google has proven it is able to detect the spread of seasonal flus in real time, faster than the US Centre for Disease Control, or CDC. Without going into too much detail, Google was able to look for correlations between certain search terms and the spread of the flu over time and space. The next step was to compare this data with actual data from the CDC. The search terms they were looking for were basically the symptoms of the flu, and eventually they found a combination of 45 search terms that, when used together, could indicate the flu's geolocation and spread. You can read more about this in Big Data, a Revolution That Will Transform How We Live, Work and Think, an online book by Victor Meyer-Schönberger and Kenneth Kukia. I have posted this link also in the description section below. Now that we've learned about some of the theories of surveillance, you will be in a better position going into episode 3 of this series, where I will provide instructions on how to minimize your digital footprint online. You should now have some idea of just what kind of information is at stake and how it can affect your privacy and add to your digital footprint. With this in mind, the next episode in this series will guide you in determining the steps that you can take, if you desire, to increase your anonymity online and reduce your digital footprint.